Good evening. It's good to be with you and good to see everyone that's here tonight. If you haven't figured out, I'm not the one who's usually up here speaking. Tonight falls on a fifth Sunday, and so one of the other men have an opportunity to prepare a lesson and present it to you, and so tonight I'll be doing that. And I hope that this will be beneficial to everyone here. I know it was for me, and so hope that these points that we look at will keep you engaged, because you don't want to fall asleep during this lesson, because it's titled Stay Awake. There's supposed to be a dramatic entrance of the slide right there. So the title is Stay Awake. I found it interesting how many times that sleep is mentioned in the Bible. And so especially in the New Testament. So we're going to be looking at some of these accounts, like the one that's depicted in the illustration, the background image where the apostles were sleeping in the garden while Jesus was praying. And so we'll look at that and what Jesus said to them later. When I say stay awake, we're not going to be looking at not going to be talking about how to keep from going to sleep at night. Whether by caffeine or energy drinks or no-dos or babies, crying babies or something. We're not going to be talking about that type of sleep, staying awake, because physiologically we realize that we need sleep. Sleep plays an important role in our physical health. It refreshes our minds. We go to sleep and we wake up with a sharpened mind. We also realize that it does things to help repair our body. If you turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and verse 12, we're going to be looking at that first. We see that after a hard day of work, sleep helps to repair our muscles, our joints, our blood vessels, things like that. This all happens at night if we're sleeping at night, and it works to repair us. In Ecclesiastes chapter 5 and verse 12, here the writer says, "The sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not permit him to sleep." So, as we see here, the sleep of a laboring man is sweet. It's nice to come home after maybe a hard day at work, or maybe you've been working outside. Maybe you've been running errands all day for your family from dawn till dusk. It's nice to come home, and when you finally get to sleep, it's nice. It's a sweet sleep. We also see in Psalm chapter 4, verse 8, this fourth Psalm, verse 8, it's also nice to be able to go to God in prayer before sleep. Sometimes, a lot of people do that. You don't have to, but a lot of people choose to, when they lay their head down at night, to go to God in prayer. In Psalm chapter 4, verse 8, it says, "I will both lie down in peace and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety." This is nice. Those of us who believe in God can go to Him and we get peace from it. Maybe our day went well, and so at the end of the day we thank God for it before we fall asleep. Maybe it was a bad day, and so we pray to God for strength and a better day tomorrow, that better things will occur. And so we can go to sleep feeling safe in God. So sleep is usually a good thing for our mind and for our bodies. But too much sleep can be a bad thing as well. If you look at Proverbs chapter 24, for how the writer describes that kind of person as lazy and slothful. Proverbs chapter 24, verses 30 through 34, the proverb writer here says, "I went by the field of the lazy man, and by the vineyard of the man devoid of understanding. And there it was, all overgrown with thorns. Its surface was covered with nettles, its stone wall was broke down. When I saw it, I considered it well. I looked on it and received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. So shall your poverty come like a prowler, and your need like an armed man. The writer here says it's easy to spot a lazy vineyard owner. And I thought about, I grew up, my family were farmers. My grandfather, my father farmed, and most of the people around our town farmed. So it was easy to spot the lazy farmers. They're the ones you drive by, their fields are all grown up with weeds, their fences are needing repair. Usually their livestock, you could tell, were malnourished. And then you'd go by their house and you would see they're there in the middle of the day, not working, just maybe sleeping the day away. So, some instances it's easier to see the inaction of a lazy person, someone who sleeps too much. We may know other examples of people like that, so we need to make sure that we're not these type of people, lazy, sleeping the day away. But we're not talking about that type of sleep tonight. When it comes to our spiritual lives, any sleep at all can be dangerous to our souls. And so that's what we're going to be looking at tonight. And let's look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 as an example of what this type of sleep is. Paul warns the Thessalonians about it here in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 5 through 8. He says, "You are all sons of light and sons of the day. We are not of the night nor of darkness. Therefore, let us not sleep as others do, but let us watch and be sober. For those who sleep, sleep at night, and those who get drunk are drunk at night. But let us who are of the day be sober, putting on the breastplate of faith and love, and as a helmet, the hope of salvation." So in verse 6, Paul writes that he is telling them, in verse 6, is he telling them he doesn't think they should be sleeping in their beds at night? No, that's not what he's talking about here, because as we just talked about, that wouldn't have been possible for them to do. When he says, "Let us not sleep as others do," we just talked about it's not physically possible. Our bodies are not made for that. He was talking about a revival of their spiritual minds, telling them not to sleep. He called for them to cast off, or he called for them to be out of the night. Those people that are sleeping are of the night and of the darkness. He mentions again in Romans chapter 13. He mentions this again, Romans 13, verses 11 and 12. This was our scripture reading earlier, but we'll just focus on verses 11 and 12. He says, "And do this, knowing the time, that now it is high time to wake out of sleep. For now our salvation is nearer than when we first believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Therefore let us cast off the works of darkness, and let us put on the armor of light." They weren't physically sleeping, as we just talked about. He was calling for a revival of their spiritual minds. He called for them to cast off the works of darkness because their salvation was nearing. It was nearer than when they first believed. And so tonight we're going to look at 4 reasons or 4 dangers why we should stay away from spiritual sleep, why we should stay awake. The first one we're going to look at is because spiritual sleep would leave us unprepared. And this makes sense. Sleeping would leave us unprepared. It's difficult to be prepared if we're sleeping. Let's look at the parable of the virgins in Matthew chapter 25. This is verses 1 through 13. We find here that some of them were not prepared for the bridegroom to come. In Matthew chapter 25, verses 1 through 13, and Jesus is speaking here. He said, "Then the kingdom of heaven shall be likened to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. Now 5 of them were wise and 5 were foolish. Those who were foolish took their lamps and took no oil with them. But the wise took oil in their vessels and with their lamps. But while the bridegroom was delayed, they all slumbered and slept. And at midnight a cry was heard, 'Behold, the bridegroom is coming. Go out to meet him.' Then all those virgins arose and trimmed their lamps. And the foolish said to the wise, 'Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out.' But the wise answered, saying, 'No, lest there should not be enough for us and you, but go rather to those who sell and buy for yourselves.' And while they went to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the wedding, and the door was shut. Afterward the other virgins came also, saying, 'Lord, Lord, open to us.' But he answered and said, 'Assuredly I say to you, I do not know you. Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour in which the Son of Man is coming.'" Jesus closes this parable by saying, "Watch, for you don't know when the Son of Man is coming." We'll talk more about this word watch that he uses because it comes up quite a bit. But the lesson we learn here is that we do not want to wait to make preparations until it's too late. The virgins were left out of the wedding because they were not prepared. We don't want to be left out either. It would be devastating to hear the words, "I do not know you." Essentially, you're not on the guest list. In Mark chapter 13, is our next verse we'll look at, Jesus talks again about sleeping when the Lord comes. Mark chapter 13, verses 32 through 37. In this chapter, Mark records Jesus speaking about a few different coming events. But this one in this section, verses 32 through 37, we recognize as talking about the final judgment. In Mark 13, verses 32 through 37, Jesus said, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Take heed, watch, and pray, for you do not know when the time is. It is like a man going to a far country who left his house and gave authority to his servants and to each his work, and commanded the doorkeeper to watch. Watch therefore, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, in the evening, at midnight, at the crowing of the rooster, or in the morning, lest coming suddenly he find you sleeping. And what I say to you, I say to all, watch." You don't want to be sleeping when the Lord returns, is what we get out of this. He says to watch multiple times. He mentions that word. I mentioned a moment ago how often that word comes up. If you look at that Greek word, watch, it means to wake or keep awake. It also means to remain alert, especially to be spiritually alert. And so that's what we'll find that applied most often, because that's going to come up again. It's almost used as the opposite of sleeping, which that makes sense. If you're not sleeping, you're watching. And what is a reason to be watching? Or what is a reason to be alert? Well, it might be watching for the adversary. And that's the second point here. The danger of spiritual sleep would be you're not watching for the adversary. We can't watch if we're sleeping. We see Jesus make this correlation between sleeping and watching in Matthew chapter 26 in verse 40. This is the night that Jesus was betrayed. This is what we talked about in the illustration on the title slide, a depiction of that event. He had went up to the Mount of Olives, and he had asked his apostles in verse 38 to stay here and watch with me, he says. And this is chapter 26 and verse 40 and 41. It says, "Then he came to the disciples and found them sleeping, and said to Peter, 'What? Could you not watch with me 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." We know after this it goes on to say that he left them again to pray and come back once again to find them sleeping. But by that time it was too late. The party had arrived the group had arrived to arrest him. But what did he want his disciples to do? To stay awake and watch with him. We understand that there is an enemy to watch out for, even for us today. We see, we'll look next at this, Matthew chapter 13. This is the parable of the wheat and the tares. Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 30. An example of why we should be watching out for the enemy. And Jesus is speaking here. He says, "Another parable he put forth to them, saying, The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. But when the grain had sprouted and produced a crop, then the tares also appeared. So the servants of the owner came and said to him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares? He said to them, An enemy has done this. The servants said to him, Do you not want us to go and gather them up? But he said, No, lest while you gather up the tares, you also uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest, and at the time of the harvest I will say to the reapers, First gather together the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. We understand this later part of this parable is relating to the judgment day, when Jesus will separate the wheat, that is the righteous, from the tares, the unrighteous. But did you notice how the tares were sowed in the first place? It says the enemy came while men slept. They were not watching the field like they should have been. This can and does happen today, doesn't it? If we're not watchful and we're sleeping, the world will come in and sow its ideas about language or apparel or marriage or sexuality or many other things. And if someone is sleeping and they're not going to notice these things being sowed, they might wake up and eventually wonder what happened to their church. They see things creeping in. What happened to their family? They see things that they didn't know was happening. And that's all because someone wasn't watching out for these, the enemy sowing these ideas. Peter also tells us who we should be watching for. We know this passage well, 1 Peter 5, verse 8, that the devil is seeking those who are not watching. In 1 Peter 5 and verse 8, Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. That word vigilant that Peter mentions, it's also translated in other versions as watchful. He's saying, be sober, be watchful. And it would make sense if the devil is preying on those who are sleeping or not watching. They would make an easy target. So we need to stay on the lookout for him, the devil. But in order to be watchful of him, we need to be sober, as Peter just mentioned, and it's mentioned again in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 6. We looked at a portion of this earlier. Paul writes in just verse 6, Therefore let us not sleep as others do, but let us watch and be sober. So again, we see that sober. So to be sober means to be of sound mind, to be free of influence of intoxicants, to be able to stay awake. We need to not only be awake, but thinking clearly, so that we know what we're looking out for. And that's what being sober-minded is involved. And while we're watching, we need to stand fast. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 13, Paul writes that we need to watch and stand fast in the faith. He says, watch, stand fast in the faith, be brave, be strong. If you think of this like a guard standing watch over either a city or a city gate or a fort, they're entrusted to watch. They're given their time. They would need to be strong and to stand fast so that they could spot the enemy. So we need to be like that also. This one's a little bit different, kind of a change of subject here as far as changing the topic. The third one here, we could, if we're spiritually sleeping, we could wake up where we did not intend to be. Okay? This one, think about Eutychus. Remember him? He's the one that fell asleep while Paul was preaching late. In Acts chapter 20 and verses 7 through 12, Acts 20 verses 7 through 12, it says, Now on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where they were gathered together, and in the window sat a certain young man named Eutychus, who was sinking into a deep sleep. He was overcome by sleep, and as Paul continued speaking, he fell down from the third story and was taken up dead. But Paul went down, fell on him, and embracing him said, Do not trouble yourselves, for his life is in him. Now when he had come up, he broken bread and eaten, and talked a long while, even till daybreak he departed. And they brought the young man in alive, and they were not a little comforted. So we find here that Eutychus fell asleep. He fell out of the window and died. And Paul brought him back to life. I assume this is why John doesn't preach in an upper room regularly. That, and probably doesn't want the liability if someone falls out of a window, especially to their death, because we would not be able to revive them now. Eutychus was in the window one moment and on the ground the next. Paul was there to revive him, though, but we may not have that opportunity if we fall asleep spiritually. We could not end up where we wanted to be. I think if you turn to Luke chapter 16, that one of the spiritual applications of this, I believe, is the story of the rich man and Lazarus. In Luke chapter 16, verses 19 through 31, Luke 16, 19 through 31, it says, There was a certain rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen and fared sumptuously every day. But there was a certain beggar named Lazarus, full of sores, who was laid at his gate, deserving to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. So it was that the beggar died, and he was carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried. And being in torments in Hades, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom. Then he cried out and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus, that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. But Abraham said, Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, and likewise Lazarus evil things. But now he is comforted, and you are tormented. And besides all this, between us and you there is a great gulf fixed, that those who want to pass from here to you cannot, nor can those from there pass to us. Then he said, I beg you therefore, Father, that you would send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may testify to them, lest they also come to this place of torment. Abraham said to him, They have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. And he said, No, Father Abraham, for if one goes to them from the dead, they will repent. But he said to him, If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rise from the dead. We find here that the rich man realized too late that he was not where he wanted to be. He had lived a life of comfort. He had gotten, you could say, spiritually sleeping. And he realized too late that he couldn't go back. He wanted to go back and change his life, but he couldn't. We need to make sure that we don't have that regret someday. To think, well, I have wanted this to be differently. If something happened and I was called to be judged, would I have wanted to do things differently? So we can make sure that we are more prepared than the rich man was. And along those lines is the last example here that the rich man possibly succumbed to, was that he was comfortable in the world that he was in. Sometimes when we become content with where we are, that's when we fall asleep. And we will look at a couple of verses here about how we might be content in the world with worldly things. If we become content in the world, we'll see in Revelation chapter 3 here, the church in Sardis, we might stop watching. We might go to sleep when we get comfortable. In Revelation chapter 3, in verses 1 through 6, John was told to write these things down, these letters. It says, And to the angel of the church in Sardis write, These things say he who has the 7 spirits of God and the 7 stars. I know your works, that you have a name, that you are alive, but you are dead. Be watchful and strengthen the things which remain that are ready to die, for I have not found your works perfect before God. Remember, therefore, how you have received and heard. Hold fast and repent. Therefore, if you will not watch, I will come upon you as a thief, and you will not know what hour I will come upon you. You have a few names, even in Sardis, who have not defiled their garments, and they shall walk with me in white, for they are worthy. He who overcomes shall be clothed in white garments, and I will not blot out his name from the book of life, but I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. We find here that the church in Sardis, they seemed alive, but they were spiritually dead. They had gotten comfortable in the world. They had stopped watching. They were no longer awake. They couldn't stay awake, and he said that if they weren't going to be watching, if they weren't going to be awake, he was going to come upon them as a thief. Another thing that might happen if we get too comfortable in this world, we get lazy. Let's look at the parable of the talents in Matthew chapter 25. We won't read all of this. We're pretty familiar with this parable of the talents, but I want to call to your attention how the lazy servant didn't do anything with what the master gave him. As you recall, and this is from Matthew 25, 14 through 30, but it starts out that the master gave one servant 5 talents, one 2, and one 1 talent. And he expected them to do something with it while he went away. And in verse 24, after he had already came to the 5-talent servant and the 2-talent servant who had doubled their money, he came to the 1-talent servant in verse 24. And he said, Lord, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. And I was afraid and went and hid your talent in the ground. Look, you have what is yours. But his Lord answered and said to him, You wicked and lazy servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. So you ought to have deposited my money with the bankers. And at my coming I would have received back my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have abundance. But from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the unprofitable servant into the outer darkness. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. We find that this 1-talent servant, the master called him lazy. He seemed to take the easy way out. Well, the other servants worked hard to double their money, to make a profit through investments. The 1-talent man, he buried it. And then you can maybe assume that he just kicked back and waited. Have you noticed he was not only called lazy, but he was called wicked. He was called a wicked and lazy servant. I thought this was interesting, that it wasn't so much his action that was wicked, it was because of his inaction that he was called wicked. Let's make sure that we're not being lazy with the ability that the Lord has given us. Let's make sure that we're using them to glorify Him and spread His word with the talents He's given us. And then the last example we'll look at is the parable of the rich fool. To see what happens when we get too relaxed with our worldly treasures. This is Luke chapter 12, verses 13 through 21. In Luke 12, 13 through 21, we'll come down to verse 16. Then he spoke a parable to them, saying, The ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought within himself, saying, What shall I do, since I have no room to store my crops? So he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build greater, and there I will store all my crops and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will these things be which you have provided? So is he who lays up treasures for himself and is not rich toward God. This man had built up treasures for himself, and then he said, it's time to take ease. It's time to relax, is another word that's used here. This is something that we need to look out for. Are we getting too comfortable with the things that might surround us, these comforts that surround us, or our worldly possessions, that we start to relax spiritually and we stop looking toward those treasures in heaven? So that was all the points. Just a couple of closing comments in conclusion here. Let us as Christians not sleep as others do. In Hebrews chapter 4, verses 9 through 11, this ties this in well, I think, why we shouldn't be sleeping spiritually while we're here on earth. There remains a rest for us, it says. I put this verse on the slide. It says, There remains, therefore, a rest for the people of God. For he who has entered his rest has himself also ceased from his works, as God did from his. Let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest, lest anyone fall according to the same example of disobedience. So let's be looking toward that rest that we will be able to enter into someday. Let us also awake to righteousness. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 34, Paul said to awake to righteousness and do not sin. And then, finally, as Christians, are we looking out for others that may be falling asleep? John talked about that this morning in the lesson, about turning to each other. Are we looking out for each other? Are we looking for those who may be nodding off spiritually? Maybe they need a nudge or wake-up call. Have you ever been driving with someone and they say, hey, can you keep talking to me? Maybe with family or friend. I don't want to fall asleep at the wheel. Keep talking to me. help me stay awake. You know, thinking about a wake-up call. I used to work at a hotel for a while, and we'd put in wake-up calls, and sometimes that system would fail, and people would miss a wake-up call, and they would call and complain that someone didn't wake them up. And if I was the one that's supposed to be doing that, then I was the one that failed in that regard to call them. But we need to be willing to help each other, to give that wake-up call if we see someone struggling. And for those that are not yet Christians, we haven't talked much about how to become one tonight, but we have talked about the necessity of being prepared when Jesus returns. And I put this verse up here from Ephesians 5, verse 14. Therefore he says, awake, you who sleep, arise from the dead, and Christ will give you light. If you believe in Christ and that He is the Son of God, you can be buried with Him in baptism. You can rise out of that water and begin a new life in Him, walking in that light. And so if there are those here tonight that would like to start that walk with Christ, walking in the light, we can help you with that. If you are a Christian and you would like the prayers of the saints here to pray with you or study with you, we can also help you with that. And so whatever your need might be, we ask that you might come forward while together we stand and sing.